They told me I was getting a controller attached to my element, and I spent the whole flight to the forward base deciding how I was going to send her back. I want to be honest about that, because everything that came after only means something if I don't hide the man I was that morning. I was 29 years old, a lieutenant with 2 deployments and a chest full of certainty, and I had built my whole idea of myself out of the belief that my team was the sharpest instrument in any room we walked into. We were 8 men who could move through a mountain in the dark without a word, who had bled together in 3 countries, who trusted each other the way you trust your own hands. And now some staff officer 3 time zones away had decided we needed a babysitter. That's the word I used, babysitter. I said it to my senior enlisted, Chief Boone, while we were still on the ramp with our gear stacked around us like sandbags. I said, "They're sending us a schoolhouse instructor, somebody who teaches the class we all slept through." Boone didn't laugh. Boone had 18 years and a face like a dropped anvil, and he had a way of not laughing that told you more than most men's opinions. But the younger guys laughed. Petrov laughed, and Kessler laughed, and even Diaz, who was usually the one telling everybody to ease off, cracked a grin, because it was funny to us. We were going into the Cavroll Valley to hold a collapsing outpost against a force that had spent 2 months learning to move at night, and the Air Force's contribution to our survival was a woman who, according to the single line of the tasking order, had spent the last 6 years running a training pipeline. Combat controller, Kessler read off his phone, squinting. Special tactics. Retired special tactics, I said. There's a difference between running with the pack and teaching puppies to sit. I remember the words exactly. I remember them the way you remember the last stupid thing you said before the ground opened up. We were staging out of a fire base the maps called Talon, a scrape of gravel and HESCO barriers pressed against the base of a mountain so big it had its own weather. The Cavroll was the only way north through that range, a long trough of a valley walled by ridgelines that ran like the spine of some drowned animal, and at the head of it sat our objective, a district outpost, 40-some local troops and a handful of advisors that had been under pressure for weeks. The enemy had learned the valley. They'd learned where our radios went static, where the satellite windows closed, where a man could climb in shadow while the moon lit the trail below. Somebody at a level far above me had decided the outpost was going to fall unless a hard element went up and stiffened it, and that we needed the ability to reach out and touch the ridgelines with something bigger than we could carry. That last part was hers. That was the whole reason they'd sent her, and I was too proud to see it. She was already at Talon when we landed, which annoyed me for reasons I couldn't have defended. I think I'd wanted to make an entrance, wanted her to see us come off the bird looking like what we were. Instead, she was sitting on an ammo crate outside the operations tent with her back against the HESCO, a radio in her lap, a spool of antenna wire beside her, doing something patient with her hands. She didn't get up when we walked past. She didn't look impressed. She looked like a mechanic waiting for a part. She was older than any of us by a decade and change. I found out later she was 46, though she carried it like a woman who'd never once wondered what her face was doing. Gray coming into dark hair pulled back tight, a jaw you could have set a level against. She wore the same multicam we did, plate carrier worn soft at the edges, and her gear was the least remarkable thing I had ever seen on an operator. No patches worth reading, nothing squared away for show, everything squared away for use. Her rifle was clean and unglamorous. Her hands were what I noticed, though at the time I only half noticed them, the way you half notice a thing your mind isn't ready to understand. Her hands were scarred. The skin across the backs of them and up under the cuffs was that tight, shining, pulled smooth texture that skin gets when it has been burned and has decided, against the odds, to keep living. "Lieutenant Corrigan," she said before I'd said anything. Her voice was low and even, no warmth in it and no coldness either, just level. "Chief Master Sergeant Vale, I'll be your controller." "Chief," I said, "appreciate you coming up." I did not appreciate it. She heard that I did not. "You've got a controller organic to the team," she asked. We manage our own fires, I said, which was a young man's answer, and both of us knew it. We could call in support the way most ground elements could, competently, by the book, on a good day. What she was asking in her flat way was whether we could do what she did, and the answer, though I would have swallowed my own teeth before saying it, was no. Nobody on my team could do what she did. I just didn't know yet what that was. She nodded, filed it, and went back to her antenna, and I walked into the operations tent feeling, absurdly, like I'd won something. Boone came in behind me. He didn't say anything for a minute, just studied the map on the plywood board. The Cavern drawn out in grease pencil, the Taneg Ridge running along its eastern wall, the outpost circled at the far end with a date next to it that was a guess at how long it had left. "You know who that is," Boone said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't friendly. "An instructor," I said. "You slept through the class," Boone said, echoing my own joke back at me with none of the humor. "You said it yourself." He tapped the board, right where the Taneg Ridge crowded the trail down to a knife's width. "There's exactly one reason Command spent a controller on a mission this size, and it's that they think the only thing that's going to keep us alive up there is what she can bring down out of the sky. I'd think about that before I decided she was luggage." I should have listened. Boone had never once been wrong about a person in all the years I'd known him. But I was 29, and the mountain hadn't taught me anything yet, and I let his warning slide off me like water off a stone. That night I watched her from across the fire base without meaning to. She'd finished her antenna and strung it up between two poles at an angle I didn't understand, and now she was sitting with a headset on and a notebook open on her knee, and she was listening. Just listening. Not talking. Every so often she wrote something down. The younger guys had drifted over to her end of the camp the way young guys do, half to needle her and half out of curiosity, and I heard Kessler ask her, with that grin, what she was teaching these days. "Whoever's dumb enough to sign up," she said, not looking up. "What's a controller do all day at a schoolhouse anyway?" Petrov said. "Point at slides." She wrote something in her notebook. "Mostly I teach kids like you not to die because they thought they knew more than the mountain," she said, still not looking up. "It's a small class. A lot of people fail it." Petrov laughed, but it came out a beat late, and I saw him glance at Kessler to check whether he was supposed to be offended. Nobody quite was. She had a way of saying a hard thing so plainly that it landed before you could decide to be angry about it. And by the time you decided, she was already 3 sentences past you, still listening to her radio, still writing in her book. I told myself she was managing us, handling us, the way an old sergeant handles a room full of privates with worn-out lines she'd used 100 times. I told myself the scars on her hands were probably some accident, a burn pit, a fuel fire, the kind of thing that happened to people who spent their careers behind the line. I built a whole small person out of her and set that person on a shelf in my head where I kept the people who didn't matter, and I went to sleep certain I'd figured her out. In the morning we moved. The plan was 3 days on foot up the western wall of the Cavern, over the shoulder of the range where the enemy didn't expect a hard element to come, and down onto the outpost from above. It was good terrain for us and bad terrain for radios, which was the whole problem. The deeper we pushed into that valley, the more the mountain ate our signals, and there'd be long stretches where the only thing that could reach the outside world was the gear Chief Vale carried on her back. She carried a lot of it. I noted, with the small meanness of a man looking for evidence, that her ruck was heavier than anyone's, and I decided it meant she'd be slow. She wasn't slow. We set a hard pace up the western wall. The kind of pace that's meant to bleed the weak out early, and by the second hour I understood I was not going to bleed her out. She moved the way water moves downhill, no wasted effort, no fighting the ground, every step placed where the mountain wanted it placed. She didn't talk. She didn't complain. When we stopped, she was already doing something useful with her radios, and when we moved, she was up before the order finished leaving my mouth. Around midday, on a scree slope where two of my younger men went down hard and swore. She crossed the same ground without a sound, reading the loose rock like a page she'd read before. "She's done this," Boone said quietly beside me, watching her. "Everybody's done a mountain," I said. "Not like that," Boone said and let it go. "The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I'm ashamed of, is that all the evidence was there and I refused it. I watched her read weather off the sky an hour before it turned and root us around a saddle where the wind would have pinned us. I watched her set a radio and pull a clean signal out of a dead pocket where my own communicator got nothing but hiss. I watched her at every halt quietly building a picture of the whole valley in her notebook, where the sky opened, where the aircraft could come from, where the ridgelines would mask a gun run and where they wouldn't. She was doing her job in front of me, expertly, silently, and I had decided in advance that her job wasn't real, so I saw a woman writing in a book. On the second night she came and found me at the edge of our position, where I was studying the Taneg Ridge through a scope. The ridge ran along the whole eastern side of the valley, high and broken, and the trail down to the outpost passed directly beneath it for almost a mile, a stretch of open low ground with that wall of rock hanging over it. I didn't like it. I'd been telling myself I didn't like it for 2 hours without doing anything about it. "You're looking at the Tanag," she said, not a question. "It's the only way down to the objective," I said. "It's a kill box," she said. I lowered the scope. "It's a mile of exposure under a ridge," I said. "I've walked worse." "I'm sure you have," she said, and there was nothing in it, no argument, no push. She crouched beside me and looked at the ridge with her own eyes, and for a while she didn't say anything. Then she said, "If they've learned this valley the way the briefing says, they'll hold that ridge. Not the trail, the ridge. They'll let you get out into the low ground and then they'll shoot down into you from cover, and you'll have nowhere to go but forward or back, and both of those are more of the same. That's not a fight you win with rifles." "Then what do you win it with?" I said. I meant it to be sharp. It came out closer to a real question than I wanted. She didn't answer the way I expected. She didn't say me. She didn't say fast air or fire or any of the things she'd have had every right to say. She just looked at the ridge a moment longer and then she said, "You win it by deciding before you ever step into the low ground exactly what's going to happen if that ridge lights up. Not hopping. Deciding. Where the aircraft come from. What they're carrying. How close I can bring it to your heads without putting it on your heads. What the fallback is if the sky's closed. You decide all of it up here in the quiet where you can think. Because once you're down there you won't be thinking. You'll be surviving. And survival doesn't plan." It was, I understand now, the single most important thing anyone said to me on that mountain. It was the whole discipline of her trade in 4 sentences. The thing she taught in that classroom I'd sneered at. The thing that separated a man who called for help and prayed from a controller who reached up into the sky and put steel exactly where it needed to be. She was offering it to me, plainly, for free, in the dark. And I said, "We'll manage the ridge if it comes to that." She looked at me for a moment, not angry, something worse than angry, patient, the way you're patient with a thing you've seen 100 times and know how it ends. "Okay, Lieutenant," she said, and stood and went back to her radios. We moved at first light down toward the Tanag, and I walked my men into the low ground under that ridge exactly the way she'd told me not to. They came off the ridge before we were halfway across. I've replayed the first 10 seconds of that ambush more times than I can count, and what I remember most is not the noise. Though the noise was enormous, it's the correctness of it. The way it unfolded exactly as she'd said it would, like a thing she'd already seen. We were strung out in the low ground, my point element 200 meters into the open trough beneath the Tanag, when the whole eastern wall lit up at once. Not from the trail, from the ridge. Muzzle flashes stitched along a half-mile of high cover, and the first burst caught Diaz in the plate and knocked him flat, and the second walked across the ground where my men were and turned the open trough into exactly what she'd called it. A kill box. We did what we were trained to do. We got low, we got behind what little the ground gave us, We returned fire up at a ridge that was 300 feet above us and made of the kind of broken rock that hides a man completely. And I understood in the space of about 15 seconds that our rifles were meaningless. We were shooting at flashes. They were shooting at bodies. Every foot of that ridge was cover for them, and every foot of the trough was a grave for us. And the only two directions I had were forward into more of it and back the way we'd come, which was more of it in reverse. She'd told me. She'd stood on the mountain in the dark and told me the exact shape of the thing that was now happening, and I had walked my men into it because I could not stand to be taught. Corrigan, Boone's voice from somewhere to my left, flat and hard over the gunfire. We can't stay here. He was right. Staying was dying by degrees. Petrov was hit. I could hear it in the way Kessler was screaming for a medic. Diaz was up again but moving wrong, half his kit shredded. We had maybe a squad of angry, superbly trained men lying in an open ditch while an entrenched force shot down into us from cover we couldn't reach, and every second we stayed the math got worse. I keyed my radio to call it up to Talon to get anything, and I got a wall of static. The mountain had eaten the signal, exactly the way the briefing said it would, exactly the way she'd built her whole 3 days of quiet work around. I was a lieutenant with no radio and a kill box he'd been warned about, and I had one asset left, and she was already moving. I didn't give her the order. That's a thing I have to say plainly, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I did, as though in the crisis I remembered my sense and turned to her. I didn't. She was moving before I thought of her. When I rolled to find her, she was already up out of the low ground and into a fold of rock at the base of the ridge, worse cover than most of us had, more exposed, but higher, with a sliver of open sky above her that the ridge didn't mask. She'd read that fold of rock off her notebook 2 days ago. She'd known where she'd need to stand to see the sky if this ever happened, and she'd walk to it in the middle of the ambush like a woman crossing a kitchen. She had her heavier radio off her back and the handset against her ear, and she was talking. Calm. That's the thing I will never get out of my head, the calm. Rounds were coming off the rock a foot above her and kicking grit into her scarred hands, and she was speaking into that handset in a low, even, unhurried voice. The exact same voice she'd used to tell Kessler she taught a small class, and she was reading numbers off the valley she'd spent 3 days memorizing. I crawled to her. I don't know what I meant to do, take over maybe, some last reflex of the man who managed his own fires. She didn't look at me. She held up one scarred hand, flat, wait, the way you'd quiet a room, and she kept talking, and I heard what she was saying for the first time, and I stopped. She wasn't calling for help. She was running a problem. Say again, I've got troops in contact, danger close, elevated enemy on the eastern ridgeline. My position is the low ground to their west, she said. I need you to understand the geometry before you're overhead because we're going to be threading this. Friendlies are below the guns. The enemy is above us and dug in. I'm going to walk you along the ridge, north to south, and I'm going to bring it in closer than you'll want to. Copy my mark when you're inbound. A crackle answered her. Far off, thin, but there, a voice out of the sky, and behind it the sound I would come to think of for the rest of my life as the sound of being saved. Though I didn't know it yet. A low, building growl from somewhere beyond the head of the valley, turbine and propeller, something big and old and unhurried coming on. They're airborne, I said stupidly, loudly. They've been airborne, she said, still not looking at me, and for the first time there was the faintest edge under the calm, not fear, something closer to a teacher who has run out of patience for a slow student in a moment that doesn't allow for slowness. I put them on station this morning, before we stepped off. That's what I was doing on the radio while your men were laughing at my antenna. I don't wait for the fight to ask for help, Lieutenant. I bring the help with me, and I hold it over your head where you can't see it, and I pray to God I never have to use it. Now get down and let me work. I got down. What happened over the next 4 minutes I have tried to describe to other operators, men who understand close air support, men who have called it in themselves, and I have watched their faces change when I get to the part about how close she brought it. Because there's the way it's done, And then there's what she did. And the gap between the two is the gap between a competent man and something I don't have a clean word for. The aircraft came over the head of the valley, and I got my first look at them, and they were A-10s. Two of them. Ugly, blunt, magnificent old machines built around a gun the size of a man, and they came down the length of the cavern low and slow in a way that no fast jet ever could, and I understood suddenly why she'd wanted them and not something sleeker. She needed something that could loiter. Something that could come in low and deliberate, and put a burst of fire onto a strip of ridge 40 meters from my men's heads without walking it across their backs. She needed a scalpel that flew, and she'd reached up 2 hours before the fight and put two of them in the sky above a valley where nobody thought to look. "Gun run north to south along the ridge," she said into the handset, and now her voice had changed again, clipped, precise, every word carrying exact meaning, a language stripped of everything but function. "From your run-in you'll see friendlies in the low ground to the west. They'll be marked. Your target is the ridgeline, the high broken rock, 40 meters east of the smoke. I need it tight. I have friendlies, danger close. I acknowledge the risk. I'm accepting it. Walk with me." She lifted a small canister, popped it, and rolled it out into the trough where it began to pour purple smoke into the air. "Smoke's out. Friendlies are on the smoke side. Everything east of the smoke is yours. Confirm you want it 40 meters off your smoke," the voice from the sky said, and even through the static I heard what was in it. Not doubt exactly. The careful, deliberate weight of a pilot who has been asked to fire a 30mm cannon very close to the people he's trying to save, and who wants to hear, one more time, that the person asking him knows precisely what they're asking. "I confirm 40 meters, she said. "I've got it, bring it." There was the smallest pause, and then the pilot's voice came back, and it was different, steadier, and under the steadiness something I can only call recognition, the sound of a man who has just placed a voice he wasn't expecting to hear. "Say your call sign, controller," the pilot said. She keyed the handset. For the first time in 3 days, something that was almost a weariness came into her voice, the weariness of a name she'd carried a long way and didn't reach for lightly. "Firebrand," she said. The valley was full of gunfire and the growl of turbines and my own men shouting, and still, somehow, I heard the silence that came down the net after that word. A held breath in the sky. "Copy that," the pilot said, and his voice had gone quiet and formal, the voice of a man standing up straight without moving. "Firebrand, it's an honor. We'll put it wherever you want it. Every one of us learned this off your card. Talk us in, Chief." And she did. I have to slow down here because this is the part that changed me, and if I rush it I'll turn it into a war story, and it wasn't a war story. It was a woman doing a hard thing perfectly, under fire, without ever once raising her voice. The first rolled in from the north, dropping down the spine of the Tanag, and she talked it the whole way, left 5 meters. Hold, that's your line, cleared hot. And the world came apart along the ridge 40 meters from my men. The gun on that aircraft doesn't sound like a gun. It sounds like the sky being torn in a single long tearing breath, and a line of the ridge where the muzzle flashes had been simply ceased to be, a rolling wall of rock, dust, and fire walking north to south exactly where she'd put it, and not 1 foot closer to us. The pressure of it hit me in the chest through the ground. Grit rained down on my helmet, and the guns on the ridge that had been killing us went silent in that stretch, all at once, snuffed. "Good effect, come off and set up for the south end," she said, already looking, already reading, her scarred finger tracing the ridgeline in the air. "Second aircraft, your target's the southern cluster. They'll displace toward the draw when their north end goes quiet. I want you on the draw before they reach it. Hold high till I call it." "They're doing it," Boone said beside me now, his voice strange. "They're breaking north to south exactly like she. How does she?" "She knew," I said. It was all I could say. She'd known where they were and where they'd run to when the fire came, because she'd spent 3 days building the whole valley in her head while I decided she was writing in a diary. The enemy on that ridge did the one thing left to them. They broke from the shattered north end and displaced south toward a draw that offered cover. And she had a second aircraft already hanging in the sky above that exact draw, waiting, because she'd read their retreat before they'd decided on it. Second aircraft cleared hot on the draw, she said, calm as still water. Same discipline. Friendlies are west, walk it. The second fell out of the sky onto the draw, and the tearing breath came again, and the last of the fight on that ridge came apart. The whole thing, from the first flash off the ridge to the silence after, took less than 9 minutes. 9 minutes. I've stretched them across the rest of my life. When the guns stopped, the quiet was so total it hurt. The A-10s came back around once, low and slow, a long, unhurried pass down the length of the valley, and I understood without being told that it was a gesture, a wing dipped, a pass made, the way an old cavalry would have ridden a line. And then they climbed out to hold high again, because Firebrand hadn't released them, and they weren't going anywhere until she did. She was still in her fold of rock. She hadn't moved through the whole of it. She was checking on my men now over the net and by eye, counting heads, making sure the medics had reached Petrov and Diaz, and only when she'd accounted for every one of us did she key the handset one last time. Effects are good, threats neutralized, I've got no further targets, she said. Outstanding work up there. I owe you a coffee I'll never buy you. Firebrand out. A pause, then quieter almost to herself as she set the handset down. Thank you. I came across the rock to her. My hands weren't steady. Hers were those scarred, shining hands, coiling the antenna wire with the same patience she'd used 2 nights before, as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't just reached into the sky and pulled all of us back from the edge of the world. I didn't have words. I want to tell you I said something worthy of the moment. I didn't. I said, you put them on station this morning. I put them on station every morning. We're outside the wire, she said, not looking up from the wire. Most days they fly home bored. That's the goal. A good day is one where I'm the most useless person on the mountain. She finished the coil, tied it off, looked up at me at last. You had a good plan, Lieutenant. It was just built on the idea that nothing would go wrong on the one stretch of ground where everything could. That's not a flaw in you. That's the flaw in everybody who's never had the sky fall on them. You learn it once, and then you never walk under a ridge like that again without a plan for it. You tried to teach me that, I said. 2 nights ago, you told me exactly what would happen. I did, she said. No accusation in it, just true. Why didn't you? I stopped. I'd been about to ask why she hadn't pushed harder, gone over my head, made me listen. And I heard how it sounded before I finished it, heard that I was asking her to have saved me from myself, and I let it die. She answered it anyway, gently. Which was worse than if she'd let me hang. Because you were the ground force commander, she said, and I was the attachment nobody wanted, and if I'd gone around you it might have worked once and cost you the team's trust for the rest of the deployment. Some lessons you have to let a man walk into. I just made sure that when you walked into it I had 2 aircraft over your head. She almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but the shape of it was there. That's the job. Let them learn. Don't let them die learning. It was Boone who told me the rest that night. Back inside the wire at the outpost we'd finally reached because of her. Walked the last mile of the Taneg under a sky she owned. The advisors up there had come out to meet us, and I'd seen one of the older ones, a weathered warrant officer with a lot of miles on him, catch sight of Chief Vale and go very still, and then walk straight to her and take her scarred hand in both of his without a word. I hadn't understood it. Boone understood it. You really don't know who she is, Boone said. We were sitting against the outpost wall, the mountain black and enormous above us, my men quiet in the way men get quiet after the sky has opened over them. A combat controller, I said. Special tactics, I get it now, Boone, I get it. You don't, Boone said. Not the half of it. He was quiet a moment, choosing it. You know the danger close procedures we all train on. The card. The one every controller and every JTAC in the fleet works off of, the geometry, the run-in headings, the whole discipline of putting fire that close to friendlies without killing them. Yeah. She wrote it, Boone said. Not helped write it, wrote it. 20 years ago she was a young controller on an operation that went as wrong as they go, a valley not unlike this one, an element pinned, no procedure yet for bringing fire in as tight as it needed to be. And she improvised it under fire on the fly, and she brought a whole element home that should have died, and afterward they took what she'd done and they made it the standard. Every man who called that pilot in tonight, every JTAC in the fleet, learned to keep friendlies alive off the thing she invented in the worst 9 minutes of her life. I looked across the outpost to where she sat, alone, doing something patient with a radio. "The hands," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "The hands," Boone said. "That operation. The element she saved, one of the vehicles was burning, men still in it. The fire support was inbound and she had the timing to the second. She could have stayed in her cover and let it come. She went into the fire and pulled 2 men out of a burning vehicle first, and then she got back to her position and called the strike that saved the rest with her hands looking like that. Burned to the bone, kept talking, never left the net." Boone shook his head slowly. "That's why they call her Firebrand. It was a joke at first, some pilot's gallows humor about the woman who went into the fire and then called down more of it. And it stuck, because there wasn't a better word. She spent 20 years since then teaching kids like you and me the thing she paid for with her hands, so that the next time a valley goes wrong, somebody who isn't her can still bring everyone home." I sat with that in the dark for a long time. I thought about the ramp at the fire base 3 days and a lifetime ago. They're sending us a schoolhouse instructor, somebody who teaches the class we all slept through. I thought about my men laughing at her antenna while she quietly put 2 aircraft over a valley that was about to try to kill us. I thought about you slept through the class, Boone's voice, and I understood at last that he hadn't been joking either. I had slept through her class. We all had. And she'd gone up the mountain with us anyway, carrying the heaviest ruck, saying nothing, holding the sky over the heads of men who thought she was luggage, because that was the job, and the job didn't care whether we respected her. I went to her before I slept. I owed her something and I didn't fully know what. She was still with her radio, still listening, always listening. She looked up when my shadow reached her. "Chief," I said. And then everything I'd meant to say went out of me, because there wasn't a version of it that didn't sound small next to what she'd done, and I ended up just standing there, a lieutenant with nothing left of the man who'd walked off that ramp. "Sit down, Lieutenant," she said, not unkindly. "You look like a man carrying something heavy." I sat. "I called you luggage," I said. "It was the ugliest true thing I had, and I put it on the ground between us because I didn't know how else to start. On the ramp, before I ever met you, I called you a babysitter, a schoolhouse instructor. I told my men you taught the class we all slept through." She was quiet. Then evenly, "I know, Kessler told me he thought it was funny," a pause. "He doesn't think it's funny anymore." "I'm sorry," I said. That's not enough, but I'm sorry." She looked at me for a while with those level eyes, and the mountain wind moved between us, and when she spoke it wasn't the reprimand I'd braced for. It was worse and better than that. It was the truth, given plainly, the way she gave everything. "You want to know the thing I actually teach," she said. "In that classroom you slept through. It isn't the geometry. Anybody can learn the geometry. What I teach is that the most dangerous man on any mountain is the one who's decided in advance that he already knows where the help is coming from and how much he'll need. Because that man walks his people into the low ground. Every time. I've buried people who died under a ridge exactly like the Tanag, Lieutenant, because their commander was sure he had the measure of it." She let that sit. "You almost were that man. You're not now. That's the whole class. It costs what it cost you tonight, and it's the only lesson that ever sticks." "Why'd you go into the fire?" I said. The question had been building in me since Boone told it. 20 years ago. You had the strike timed. You could have stayed in your cover and brought everyone home anyway. Why go in after those 2 men with your own hands? For the first time since I'd met her, she was quiet in a way that wasn't control. She looked down at her hands, turned them over in the dim light. The shining pulled smooth scars catching what little there was. "'Cause the strike would have saved the element," she said slowly. "And the fire was going to kill those two before it landed, and I could count. I had about 40 seconds where I could either be a controller or be a person, and I couldn't figure out how to be only one of them." She closed her hands. "People make it into more than it was. A pilot gave me a call sign as a joke, and it followed me around, and now young men look at my hands like they're scripture. They're not scripture. They're just what it cost. I'd have rather kept the skin and never had the name." She looked up at me. "Every one of those kids in my classroom wants the name, Lieutenant. The story. The call sign the whole fleet goes quiet for. And I spend the whole course trying to teach them that the name is the worst thing that ever happened to me, and that if they do the job right, if they plan, if they hold the sky over people's heads before the fight, if they never walk anyone into a kill box they were warned about, then they'll never earn a name like mine, and that's the goal. A controller nobody ever writes a song about is a controller who never watched anyone die. Be forgettable. Be so good that nothing interesting ever happens. That's the whole trade." I understood then why she'd let me learn it the hard way, and why she hadn't gloated, and why she'd sat in that fold of rock under fire as calm as a woman at a kitchen table. The calm wasn't nerve. It was grief, worn down over 20 years into something that looked like nothing at all. The composure of a person who had already been to the bottom of it once and had decided, with her ruined hands, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure fewer people had to go there. In the morning, the whole team stood for her. I didn't order it. There's no order for that. We were staging to move again, and she came out of the operations shelter with her heavy ruck and her radios, ready to walk point on the sky the way she'd walked it the whole way up, and my men were already up and squared away, and when she stepped out into the gray morning light they came to attention. All of them. Kessler, who'd needled her about slides. Petrov, arm in a sling, on his feet anyway. Diaz. Boone, who'd known all along. 8 hard men who 3 days ago had laughed at her antenna. Standing to attention on a mountain outpost, as a 46-year-old woman with burned hands walked out to carry the heaviest ruck up the trail. She stopped. For just a second, something moved across that level face, and I saw how unused to it she was, how she'd spent 20 years making sure nothing interesting ever happened, and here were 8 men making the thing happen anyway, because there hadn't been any way for them not to. "At ease," she said low. "We've got a valley to clear." But I didn't let it go at that. I owed her the words in front of the men who'd heard me say the others. So I said it plainly. The way she'd taught me plain was the only thing that landed. "Chief Master Sergeant Vale wrote the procedure that kept every one of us alive yesterday," I said, loud enough to carry. "She put aircraft over our heads before we stepped off, because she doesn't trust the mountain, and she was right not to. She walked us the whole way up carrying more than any of us, and I called her luggage before I met her. I was wrong in a way I'm going to spend the rest of my career being ashamed of. There isn't a man on this team who's fit to carry her ruck. But she'll let us try, fall in behind the chief." And I brought my hand up and I held it there, and Boone came up beside me and did the same. And then all of them, the whole team, saluting a woman the Air Force had listed on our tasking order as an attachment nobody wanted. She let us hold it for a moment. Then she did the thing I will remember about her longest. She didn't wave it off, and she didn't stand on it. She brought her own scarred hand up and returned it once cleanly, soldier to soldiers, an acknowledgement between people who had finally understood each other. And then she turned and started up the trail, point on the sky, and we fell in behind her, where we'd belonged the whole time. I've thought about her every deployment since. Every time I've stood at the edge of some low ground with a ridge hanging over it, I've heard her voice. "You decided up here, in the quiet, where you can think. And I've made the plan, and I've held the sky over my people's heads before the fight, and most days the aircraft have flown home bored. A good day is one where I'm the most useless person on the mountain." I learned that off a woman with burned hands who tried to teach it to me in the dark, and who I called luggage, and who put 2 aircraft over my head anyway, and never once raised her voice. They gave the SEALs a schoolhouse instructor, and we laughed. We were the ones with everything to learn.